All right. Should I just launch in then? Well, welcome everyone. It's nice to be back. And Ed, nice to see you. Um, I think the concept for this session was to remember and celebrate the work of in the life of Daniel Dennett, um, fellow philosopher and man for whom I have a great deal of admiration. Um, Uh, so I volunteered to lead this not because I'm particularly well versed in his work, although I've been exposed to enough of it to have a feel, I guess, for some of it, and enough to know that his instincts, philosophical instincts, are close enough to mine to that and much more deeply grounded in the science, so that I can often rely on his take on things. Um, I thought I'd just share a few memories myself, invite you guys to share memories or thoughts that you have about his work and maybe its impact on you. And perhaps we can collectively reckon in some way with Dan's legacy um, and uh, just by remembering it. Um, I'm not a philosopher of mind, and I've actually read very little about the consciousness, the roots of consciousness and free will. I discovered Dan's work after I had given up tenure and left academia, and found it at a time when I was really chafing at how technical and abstruse so much academic prose had become. And I really liked Dan's work because he worked hard to make his stuff accessible to non-specialists. And that really spoke to me at a time when I was teetering on the brink of at one foot inside of academia and one foot outside it. Um, I think I came across his Darwin's Dangerous Idea, um, and then later Breaking the Spell. Those are the two books of his that I've really studied carefully. Then came to really enjoy Dan's talks and on YouTube. The stance he uh, worked out in Breaking the Spell, both towards religion and about how memes can replicate at our expense, really spoke to me. And I then corresponded with him for some time. I had the honor of bestowing my university's Carl Sagan Award on Dan. He gave a lovely speech about the evolution of control systems and how basically how freedom evolves, how the ability to decide and choose can actually emerge in a deterministic universe. I thought it was tremendously insightful and profound. And then I was invited to participate in a conversation with Dan just a few weeks before he died, where several of us where Dan actually was really passionate to share some deep concerns he had about the new generation of large language model AIs and their potential impact on the world. And because some of his earlier writings on the subject seemed to say, we got plenty of time to figure this out, it was actually kind of startling to see Dan say, this could get bad really fast. And a man with his judgment and wisdom he wasn't prone to alarmism, and yet he had become deeply concerned because of how quickly generative AI had progressed. Um, Again, I'm a big fan and recommend his Darwin's Dangerous Idea, his Breaking the Spell, his book on religion and how religion evolved. I like and have taught from his book Kinds of Minds, which is one of his less well-read books. But I'm actually not very familiar with some of his more academic books like Consciousness Explained, Intuition Pumps, and Other Tools for Thinking is more recent. I've only gotten a little ways into that. And From Bacteria to Bach and Back, it's another book that I'm told is well worth your time. Anyway, I thought I'd um, wrap up there and invite you guys to share some of your memories. Ed, you gave a lovely session to this group, I recall, on a paper of Dan's on arguing for an anti-essentialism. Maybe you could start us off, because I thought that was a really nicely run session on a really important essay.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to keep it brief. Yeah, I will share. I just pulled that page up, so I thought I might share that link with the group later. And I did. So it was called Darwin and the Overdue Demise of Essentialism, and it was in a collected anthology about how biology shapes philosophy that I came across. And yeah, his work was really inspirational for that particular paper could be thought of as an inspiration for all of the work I had been doing for years or so. For me, it was um, just proof that I was on the right track and in following him as well. Um, so I've read just a handful of his books. I just looked through my archive zone. I had 15 of his papers downloaded. That I tend to find them more accessible. They're less door stoppers, as his books tend to scare me off from that a little bit. Um, but I haven't read anything of his that I wanted to throw across the room, which I can't even say that about my own philosophy. So that's that's as high praise as I have for another writer. So yeah, and I think I'm embarrassed that I started a website called Evolutionary Philosophy before I had read Dan Dennett, and I was um, grateful that when I finally came across and decided to plunge into Darwin's Dangerous Ideas, that I again found that I was on the right track, but boy, did I have a long way to go to catch up to the thoughts that he was already pioneering in that field. So, yeah, he was a brilliant man, and I got to interact with him just once briefly, where I'd met another philosopher called Greg Caruso, who is big in the field of determinism and anti-free will beliefs, and he wrote a back and forth epistolary, that's our word, book with Dan Dennett called Just Desserts. And I just mentioned to Greg that I was looking forward to reading it and getting, and he said, "Oh, do you want to write a review for it?" And he helped me get that published in Three Quarks Daily, which had a pretty good readership at the time. And Dan, I'd heard through secondhand that he said, "Oh, that's a very good review," and that's that's because I sided with him more in the debate with him and Greg, and that's some of the best praise that I hold dear to my writing so far. So
Well,
I'll stop there. I will put a link in the chat, or not link, but list of all the papers that I have from him that are they might grab your attention and be much quicker reads than his books.
nice. Yeah, thank you, Ed. Feel free to chime in here, guys. Steve?
Um, I I was really influenced by Darwin's Dangerous Idea, which I read early on when I began to be interested in evolutionary psychology in particular. It just was sort of an eminently sensible book. There was hardly a sentence in it I disagreed with. I still remember all these years later one sentence in it in which he said evolution was an algorithm for creating design out of chaos without the aid of mind. Speaking about how it's non-teleological, and I just thought what a pithy and lovely way to make that point. In contrast to that, years later, I read Freedom Evolves, and I read that in tandem with my eldest son, who was a philosophy major, and we would get together for lunch and we would discuss that book, and I found that book torturous, and didn't buy his arguments about free will. It seemed to me he was trying to simply define it into existence by how he chose to define the terms. So, and I did read Breaking the Spell as well, and I like that book very much. So he's batting 2 out of 3 with me. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, Diane.
I actually had a chance to listen to him in person once, even though I was in Istanbul, because he came to visit the philosophy department at the university I was at in those days. Um, and I had read Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and it was a revolution for me, actually. The quote that stuck with me, uh, it's not the same one that stuck with Steve, is that Darwin's idea is that evolution is universal acid. It will eat through any container. And I said, wow, what is this? Because I had been brought up in, let's say, the anti sociobiology atmosphere of the late 60s and 70s, which was completely uh, against the idea of using evolution in social science, essentially. So this was my first exposure to a plausible way. Not only plausible, it hit me over the head. So it was really a turning point for me. Then I read about a bunch of the others, including his memoirs. Most recently, I just finished that basically right before he died. So it was full of his, anecdotes and memories. And I was astonished by what an energetic man he must have been. Unbelievable. All the stuff he did, all the physical work and the music and all kinds of things that you wouldn't expect from a philosophy professor. So,
I wish I had his cider to drink right now.
right.
His universal
he
cider.
was a major influence on me, I have to say.
Diane, what was the music that he did?
Well, when he was very young, he thought actually of becoming a musician instead of studying philosophy. And I think he was doing jazz or something, whatever. And he was a pianist.
Okay.
But he was also a sailor, and he was also, a carpenter and a farmer and all kinds of things. The autobiography is really very interesting because it's got his ideas woven into it, of course, all the people he fought with and disagreed with and liked and whatever, lots of anecdotes. But as a life, it's also very interesting.
Curious if anybody else experienced Dan's demeanor and delivery, the way he spoke, as very kind and patient and wise. And he almost just exuded to me. I mean, I suppose Dan could have a sharp wit as much as anyone, but to me, just the way he conducted himself, he tried really hard just to be understood and to understand others. And he came across to me very much like, there's a little bit of Fred Rogers in him. He just wanted to help. And I admired that. I didn't see any evidence of mean-spiritedness in him at all, although I guess he could get competitive. And that does come up in his biography, memoirs.
Yeah, can I add to that? Yeah, I would use the word avuncular. Yeah, it always comes to mind whenever I hear his voice in my head as the kind old uncle. And that just to add on quickly, but I was really struck in his memoir just how many summers and trips he spent with people he vehemently disagreed with about consciousness in particular. That he was very willing to write sharp-tongued, but apparently was kind enough to set that aside and still be friends with these people because they had so many other things in common. That's something to really take to heart for philosophers.
Yeah, he used to spend time on a very small boat with Jerry Fodor. And imagine how those two are about as far apart philosophically as it's possible to be. So he was practicing adversarial collaboration before that was a thing.
He also had a gift for the telling phrase. I mean, Steve said he wasn't convinced by his argument on the freedom evolves, but he kept talking about the kind of freedom that's worth having. And I thought that was a wonderful way to look at it, you know, not as something terribly abstract, but, you know, what is it when we talk about free will, what is it that we want? What is it worth to us?
Diane, I should add that I didn't have any choice about disagreeing with his argument about free will.
Well, who knows whether we have any choice in anything, but just the idea that maybe there is freedom worth having, I thought was an inspiration.
Yeah.
May I ask a question? Which is, of the modern horsemen of atheism, I believe he's one of them. The other one, another one, Sam Harris, has said a lot about mindfulness and its value. And just in what you said about Mr. Dennett, I wonder if he's had, I wonder if they, is anyone aware of any conversation the two of them had between on the subject? Because his behavior sounds very enlightened to me, to be very frank. Is anyone aware of any conversations that Sam and I'm sure they knew each other?
Yeah, there's quite a few podcasts. Well, the talks and one of the papers that I linked to was Dan's review of Free Will by Sam Harris. So he reviewed his book, and they clashed quite a lot about that, about Sam's view on free will. And I think Dan really dismissed him as not a deep thinker on that subject, and Sam was, I think, hurt by that. And I don't know, I've never heard them talk about meditation. I don't think that Dan would have. I don't remember if he's done much of that, but he didn't like Sam's take on things. I know that for sure.
And
I'm
about
just wondering if anyone ever ran by Mr. Dennett, you know, the psychological basis of mindfulness, and you know, the fact that it's now being studied by so many scientists, and if he had any comment on that, but apparently that's not the case.
Yeah, so Sam Harris's thing was that, you know, when you have the no self experience in meditation, that demonstrates we have no free will, which I think is kind of a nonsense statement. So I'm with Dan.
That's not Sam's only argument against free will, in fairness to Sam, but
it seemed to be, I watched one thing and that's what he said, and I didn't go further. So you probably know much more than I do.
I wonder if Dan,
more than I do.
I wonder if Dan knew John. I'm blanking on his first name, Kabat-Zinn.
Don Kabat-Zinn. Yeah.
John Kabat-Zinn. I know that Dan was at Tufts, and I think Zinn was in Boston somewhere. So I may be wrong about that, but their paths might have crossed.
You don't mean Howard Zinn, the historian?
Yeah. You know, what did I say?
No, I don't.
He's a
John's
meditation.
John was in Western Massachusetts.
Yeah. So they
So
might.
No, John Kabat-Zinn was at Boston, was at UMass Boston. I'm quite certain of that.
Yeah.
So I just put an image that isn't very big. This was my takeaway from Darwin's dangerous idea, just basically because what I was thinking about at the time. But it's a logic test, and you have to, how many cards do you have to turn over to figure out a rule? And the top one is in abstract terms. I can't remember exactly what it is, but the bottom one rephrases exactly the same puzzle in terms of entitlement. It'd be, which cards do you have to figure out if someone is obeying the drinking age? And you would have to flip over the 16-year-old to see if they're drinking Coke, and the beer to see if they're over 16. And people are really bad at the first puzzle, but very good at the second puzzle. And it's a great argument for multi-level selection, in my opinion, because it shows that we have a cognitive bias towards cheater detection. And, you know, I mean, the whole haystack model implies competing groups. And the big problem for any group is keeping the cheaters under control. So, you know, you could also argue for kin selection in the same terms, but, and I think Dennett was totally not a multi-level selection guy.
I agree with that. And you know, the other thing in Darwin's dangerous idea that made a big impact on me was the idea that, and I think someone alluded to, Diane alluded to this with the quote about how it is a universal asset. The idea that the essential algorithm of natural selection can be applied to lots of phenomenon in the world. I had, previous to reading that book, I mean, I had understood the basics of natural selection as it applied to the evolution of you know, species. But Dan explaining it as an algorithm that could be applied, that I think his term was, it's substrate neutral, is what he said.
Yes.
And that you could apply it to other things. That was really eye-opening for me.
And we now know that the trial and error winnowing that occurs in basic Darwinian evolution occurs also. The immune system runs a version of that. The cultures run a selection process on their contents and continually adapt or evolve.
Yes.
Content.
And Dawkins may have, in some sense, beat him to the punch on cultural evolution because he talked about memes, I think, earlier than Dennett published Darwin's Dangerous Idea. But I felt that Dennett's sort of exposition of that was fuller than Dawkins. Who also is recently retired, I believe. Dawkins has just said he's done his last book tour or whatever.
So.
Stepping out of the limelight.
I think to be fair to Richard, I think he did talk about universal Darwinism in way back in '76 in The Selfish Gene, and so he had the idea that it's something like an algorithm that can play out on different systems, and he basically says memes can replicate and be selected for in culture just as genes are in our bodies. And so he had something idea, but you're right. Dan extended it in a really neat and general way. On Ken's question about whether Dan ever engaged with Sam's ideas about mindfulness, I'm not aware of any particular place where he did, but I was at a Center for Inquiry conference where both of their ideas were discussed. This is kind of at the height of their Four Horsemen fame. And I guess Sam had already turned his attention to writing Waking Up, his book on mindfulness. And there were certainly many people at the conference among rationalists and atheists who did not at all like Sam's take on mindfulness. And they thought his thought was verging into woo. And the idea that there is no self, I've never heard Dan assert that there is no self the way Sam does. So they did have their differences, but I think they were both formidable intellects that agreed on a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, and the Buddhist concept of no self is nuanced. I mean, it went through 3 or 4 permutations over the, you know, however many 2,000-3,000 years that, you know, one the turning of that is that there's no independent self. We're so interlinked with everyone and everything around us that to abstract out an absolute self from an ever-changing set of relationships is a mistake. So there's even the whole no self concept is a multiple concepts.
There's ambiguity there, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of ambiguity.
Let me just add, if I might, that Buddha in his second speech never said there was no self. What he said is that self is not the way we think it is. Oh, you're having difficulty with my sound because of this terrible Wi-Fi, aren't we?
I am having difficulty, Ken. It might help if you turn up your volume a little bit. Why don't you try again with a higher volume and
Okay, we'll give that a shot.
I guess your volume controls would only control your input, not
Yeah,
your.
that's correct. So
Okay, never mind.
I'll give it another shot. If I see any more furrowed brows, I'll stop. Just to say that the Buddha never said there was no self. What he says is that the self doesn't have the characteristics that we think it is. One, it's not independent from everyone else. And number two, it's not definitive. That's a very long. I can see people. All right, this is not going to work. I can tell. Sorry. I'll put something in chat.
I think I got the gist there, Ken. That actually makes a lot of sense to me. So I think that's a welcome clarification. Hank, did you want to weigh in?
Only with a little joke about I'm not familiar with the work. I mean, I've read through it, but I didn't come prepared, so I'm learning a tremendous amount. But I will share this since you asked. I was looking for it. It's a little cartoon of humor about Socrates and Aristotle. And Socrates is, well, I don't know, it doesn't say who it is, but is it true, my dear Aristotle, that everything that deceives may be said to enchant? So people familiar with that. And Aristotle says, I don't know. Oh, it's Plato. I don't know Plato. Why don't you just Google it? So a little playfulness on bringing things down to earth. That's all. But it's fabulous. This is for me. It's I got too much to read now for the next 6 months on this. And thanks, Ed, for offering that material.
Can I say to build on Alan's point about the Buddhism and no self? I mean, Dan was very provocative, though, about saying that there is no that consciousness is an illusion. And he would say that there is no homunculus in the brain sitting back and observing everything. So I don't know that you would say that he so clearly disagreed with Sam Harris about that. It was more. There's one of the papers that I shared was something like on some reflections about the psychology of free will, and in there he talked about the choice I think that he had about how to discuss free will, and this was before some of the stuff about consciousness, but it was telling to me that with free will he was willing to say he thought it was too dangerous to say that free will was an illusion and didn't exist. And he liked to hold on to the free will worth wanting because I think he found it to be so important to the underpinning of moral responsibility and justice in the world. But he was happy to poke and prod consciousness by saying it's an illusion because he didn't think losing that illusion, I think, would hurt us as much. I think he was quite torn as to he sees both sides of what both these concepts actually are, and that they're not what we think they are. And so one he was willing to just rebrand, and the other one he was willing to kind of toss off. But he did that, I think, with great thought and choice.
Yeah, tried to be very, I think, case by case on those things, and
yeah.
He was very pragmatic thinker at some level. Yeah, Steve.
Well, I'm curious, Ed or anyone else. This question just popped in my head because of what you just said, Ed. Wouldn't there be some inherent contradiction between, on the one hand, saying consciousness may be illusion, but free will exists? How does one have free will if one doesn't have a non-illusory consciousness? It just occurred to me as I was listening to what you said. I don't have an answer, obviously.
Yeah, it's a long answer of the definitions of consciousness and the definitions of free will. That compatibilism is all about redefining these terms so that they are compatible, because you're right, on the face of it, they don't sound like they are compatible at all. But I'll leave it at that with that. I'd have to go back in my notes and to give a quick answer.
I'll just tack on something here and then turn the floor over to Hank. I share Dan's intuition that we're authoritative scientific sources to announce and and firmly deny that choice is real, that we have anything like free will, that could affect certain vulnerable psyches in harmful ways. I do share his pragmatic intuition that might have harmful consequences, and that it might be worth trying to steer clear of that conclusion if we can, and if we can redefine free will into something that's compatible with determinism, but also gives us the free will worth wanting and the moral responsibility holding that moral accountability holding that we need, then why not go that route? Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Hank?
Yeah, let's see if I can organize my free-floating thoughts. One is about, well, 2 things. Observer observed. I don't remember who the physicist, if anybody remembers, talks about we do change things because we're observing it. So
Heisenberg.
That's right, the Heisenberg principle. So so we do know that, well, let's say if we're going to use that theory of mind, the ability to witness and observe, whether there's a self or not from the different Buddhist perspectives, but we're observing whether there's a self or not. Now, I don't know if anybody is aware of any science that has tried to kind of parcel that out and say, well, is there a cosmic self, and does that cosmic self influence us in some, maybe even in a Darwinian way, that there's some cosmic self, and but then we don't know of any experiments that say, well, maybe there is, like Jung talked about the collective unconscious or consciousness in the different ways that people are thinking about it in the last 50 years or even more than that. But so everything is going to be subjective because we're observing from a more subjective, nuanced, culturally determined, our own character structure determined. So it's kind of difficult to say without research about the no self, what is that actually? Is there a common language? I haven't heard of any that anybody has sat down in 10 years of symposium and say, well, is there a cosmic self that is not subjective, but how do we know? Because we're all theory of mind using our subjectivity. So that's the broader thing.
What's a cosmic self?
Well, that's what we're trying to talk about. It's just my word that it's come up, but that there's an entity, whatever that entity is, that is not human in the sense that we separate out and have an idea, but there's some energy force that is it's an undifferentiated self.
And is that something, would each of us have one, or are you talking about some sort of oversoul that we share?
Oversoul. I mean, that's the construct that's being used. Yeah. So I don't know. I grapple with it all the time. And I know people who kind of deeply get involved in that. And it often turns into woo-woo a little bit, especially if you're a therapist and you're talking to people who operate from that perspective. So anyways, so we're talking about something sort of undefinable, whether it's an illusion or not. Okay, that's just a passing thought.
Thanks, Hank. Steve?
Well, two comments. One is, since Examined Lives is really talking about evolutionary science, I'm not sure if Dennett's writings and contributions about consciousness talked about the evolution of consciousness as much as what he thought the nature of consciousness was, and that they're quite different.
Yes.
And so his writings about consciousness, I think, in a way, are somewhat tangential to what the focus of our discussions typically are, compared to, for example, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, I think, is, hitting the bullseye more than his books on consciousness or free will. The only other comment I would have about the idea of cosmic consciousness, which I have no clue what that means or would be,
Nobody does, Steve.
is the fact that if we change the word consciousness to mind, our minds are social. I don't know if they're cosmic, but they're social. It's very difficult to conceptualize how one would have a mind unless you were interacting with other human beings. So mind is social, but I think that's quite different than positing something like cosmic consciousness, which has, I'm aware there's stuff there, but anyhow, the most important point I want to make is that I don't think Dennett talked about the evolution of consciousness, more just the nature of it as it currently exists.
If I
I
could
think
tack
that
on,
his,
so just to
can I
Go
come
ahead,
right
Diane.
back to Steve?
Go ahead, Dan. Yeah,
Uh,
Diane.
but he had not species evolution, but evolution of a thought in your mind. I mean, what comes to you as consciousness is something that is selected out of a lot. He talked about rough drafts.
That's still the nature
things.
of I mean in terms of the phylogeny of consciousness. How did
Yeah, no,
consciousness evolve?
no, he didn't talk about that I know of.
Yeah, Ed, and then I'd like to toss in a thought as well.
I just put in the chat that his book from I forget, it's like From Bach to Bacteria and Back Again, I think touches a little bit on what you're talking about, Steve. I haven't read that book. I've just listened to. There's a 1 hour Google lecture that he gave about that book that makes me think he probably did touch roughly on what you're talking about here. I wanted to say about the cosmic viewpoints and these Jungian archetypes. Brings up another of Dan's ideas that really influenced me a lot. Well, two things from him. One is I think he would think of those as skyhooks, as just these things just sitting out there in the ether without anything grounding them at all. And instead, I think if it was in his Darwin's Dangerous Ideas, he shared a passage from a contemporary review of Darwin's original On the Origin of Species book that a critic said here. I actually put that in my the talk that I gave to the group, and let me pull up the exact quote. It was a long quote, but I'll just say that that this, I think it was a bishop at the time, said something like, and to express in a few words all Mr. Darwin's meaning, who, by a strange inversion of reasoning, seems to think absolute ignorance fully qualified to take the place of absolute wisdom. So this was something that Dan said. This guy said as a critic to think that we must have absolute ignorance to replace absolute wisdom. And Dan said, bingo, this guy nailed it. That's exactly what we have, is absolute ignorance. We start from nothingness and grow up and outwards. And so I think, consciousness, free will, the meaning of life, many of these things all start from nothing and then slowly evolve and grow and grow. And we get more and more degrees of freedom. So we get freedom for the free will worth wanting. We get more and more information about the universe and about our thoughts, and that grows our consciousness as well. But they all start from this place of absolute ignorance and only grow and expand from there, not from some skyhook. I'll stop there.
I think Ed's got a lovely sense of how Dan's thinking works on this, and so I mean, we all know from the title of Dan's book on free will that he thinks freedom evolves, that it's a real thing, that's an emergent property of sufficiently complex control systems. So as control systems develop more and more bigger repertoires of options, something that deserves to be called free will actually emerges in sufficiently complex critters. Be with you in a minute, Alan. To address Steve's earlier question about the evolution of consciousness, just as free will evolves, I think Dan would say consciousness evolves. And the large-scale contours of the story of consciousness's origins would be evolutionary. somehow, like the simplest critters probably just had very simple control systems that simply, I don't know, fled from dangerous things and went and consumed nutritious things, right? I mean, you can imagine each of those circuits not even talking to each other, and no central place where all the information is collated to form a global picture of the organism's environment. In that sense, a paramecium doesn't have a consciousness, right? But as you begin to look at the way in which these information processing networks evolve over time, you start to realize that it becomes advantageous at a certain point to aggregate all the information that your different senses are giving you to form it into kind of a model of the world, which somehow presents kind of a picture of the world. And you can imagine something like a viewpoint or a point of view on the world emerging, and that would be something like what we mean by consciousness. So that's the rough story of rough character of the story there, but I don't know the specifics, except to say that Diane's reference to rough multiple drafts, I think, is a key part of that story as well. Yeah, Al, thanks for your patience.
Oh, sure. I only put up my hand because I couldn't find the put up your hand button at first. So my suggestion is, instead of using the term free will, just use the term agency. You know, which dovetails exactly with what you were saying. You know, a system capable of taking in information and acting on the basis of that. The whole free will thing, I think, is like a religious argument and drag. You know, it can't be God or the soul, so it can't exist. Well, maybe it exists, and you know, when we went across the pineal gland or whatever you do with Descartes' binary, you know, maybe that should have made it across, you know, as opposed to being left with the soul and all that. And in terms of our evolving perceptual system, this is kind of a pet thing of mine, is, you know, there's a concept of planning depth, right? How many moves ahead you can kind of think. And at one point, there's a hominid that's got a brain 2/3 of the size of ours, has fire, walks upright, uses stone tools, and is pretty good at saying, okay, if you, in some manner, you wait over there, and I'm going to beat on the bushes here, and the deer will run out here, and you know, even chimps can start to do that. Well, you get out a certain number of moves in planning depth, and it's like, oh shit, we're all going to die, right? And I think that's like a big inflection point in the whole concept of agency. All these things sort of combine, where we become a entity that can reflect on its own demise and the demise of everything we hold dear, baked into a system that was designed to keep us alive. And I think our sort of unique form of awareness is tinged with that throughout most everything we do. And religion begins, and the stories about, you know, how we're going to survive this all start gaining traction. And I may have wandered a bit far afield here. I apologize for that, but you know, you've hit one of my pet topics, so unfortunately, I'm slightly out of control.
It's all good, Alan. Thank you. We are at a quarter to the hour, and a few of us had talked about shifting the discussion at about this point to the future of examined lives, and whether we wanted to continue, and if so, in what form and with what logistical backing. Any last words on Dennett before I turn things over to Steve and Sage to lead that part of the discussion? Anyway, I'll just say that I'm really sorry Dan has left us. I think he was an extraordinary human being who taught us so much taught me so much about how to think deeply, and so I'll remember him.
I would say that our discussion today was much more like a meeting of Ed's old evolutionary philosophy group than Examine Lives, and certainly makes me miss those discussions, Ed, that you used to lead. Maybe the place to begin is for Sage to give us what kind of backstory that he can provide, perhaps briefly, about the decision that was announced in the email. I'm sure we all received from Dunya and David that indicated that ProSocial Commons, part of ProSocial World, was quote unquote sunsetting, which I thought was somewhat euphemistic, but nevertheless, no longer going to exist, and that has implications for Examine Live. So what can you tell us, Sage, about the backstory that led to that announcement? And for example, are you still employed by ProSocial World?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm still employed with ProSocial World
Okay.
for the time being. Uh, but yeah, I was talking with Andy, reflecting on 51 sessions, and you know, we had the insight of that Examine Lives was started kind of before ProSocial Commons existed. Very early into ProSocial World, the organization is really more in connection with This View of Life magazine, and just an initial means to, use Zoom during the pandemic, basically, to talk about all things evolutionary thinking. And it's always been pretty lightweight. We've pretty much haven't veered from the basic pattern, and we've established a nice community and set of norms that handles much of the capacity. And I think
Sage,
for
are you
all
saying
groups,
we haven't evolved? Is that what you're saying, Sage?
what I'm saying is we didn't evolve in a way that ended up being probably advantageous much with all the things that happened with ProSocial Commons. And now we find ourselves again in a place where we have to ask, is what we're doing here dependent on some organization like ProSocial World or any other organization? And I would say no. And I would say much of the ProSocial Commons community, um, the kind of lift up startup energy of finding each other in the infrastructure to meet and organize, and the staff time to do that has occurred for these past few years. And with that, the social value is embedded in us. So I think the long and short of it is that ProSocial World is in its own transitionary period for the next, 3 or so months. We'll see, basically, while we have a funding gap from the conclusion of our original source of funding from the John Templeton Foundation, which is just natural, and these things are there and then they're not. And
Hmm.
so we just don't have basically the staff and bandwidth resources to have Dunya or folks like that actively steward as an employee of ProSocial World at Commons. But I would urge us to, especially in this group, that we never had to draw on many of those resources. And more to the point, I think that the main effort, what I was trying to really get at is I was going through what are the logistics of us doing this? And it's, pretty minor, nothing we couldn't replicate on our own easily. And that the main thing is like the human effort of moderating the meetings, preparing for the topics, showing up, and just helping coordinate, which I think we steward together. Diane, Steve, Andy, myself obviously have helped moderate, and anyone else who's helped moderate or suggest topics and otherwise just pinged a question. That's the main effort, and it's what we can do as members. So as long as we're game to keep doing that, which we have been, then I would say it's pretty lightweight.
Will you
We need to-
still have access, Sage, to the same Zoom account that you're using to host this?
Yeah, so let me just go through. I'm gonna paste this here. I was just writing that down. So those are the kind of needs I identified, at least logistically. So yeah, hosting video calls is the main one. I think what all this to say, we have a few months. We don't have to, this is not requiring immediate action. So we can kind of go on as we have been, at least for the next couple sessions, figure out where we'll be by then. Say for like March, that would be when we would want to, have all this worked out. If we could continue to hosting with ProSocial World, which might be possible, even without me, just because it's once this link has been permanent, so we could continue using it and just be sort of like, can we get, say, Steve or a member representative to be the host? That could be a simple solution. Otherwise, that would be like $130 a year or something. We had to do that. But there's also probably free software, even Google Meets. So that's one thing. And then just in terms of how we share with new people about Examine Lives, which we've used the website, ProSocial World's website. Again, if we use their Zoom, then I could see that continuing as well. A little bit more coordination there. But I would say we'll use Hilo as a just initial hub. But once we get those blurbs together of each session details, we send that over email. We can just forward the emails to people. We can share it however we like. I
But
think
say is
that
right now, we, when you say we, you really mean you.
well, I mean, anyone could just whoever, posting in Hilo. I'm saying, think of it, all I've ever done is then get it onto the website. But the work of getting the copy of the title, the session, the description, we got the link, that allows you to share that with anybody. Anybody who's ever joined found some version of that. So that's all I mean. We can, instead of doing the website, we might let that go, which, to be honest, it has brought, a trickle of people, but it's not like that's, I think invite referral, that's if we ever want to grow it, just doing it that way will be the most reliable way. And what's nice with Hilo is that we can use that as an email service to send reminder communications. If you click, there's the ability to click a post, and moderators can send an email, which I tried today. And so that's helpful, I think, mainly just for reminding people and communicating to anybody on our list in that way. So all that to say is we'll have to sort out like exactly how we want to do this and answer some questions. But if we step back and think about what is the dependencies of how we've done things, it's mainly been using ProSocial World Zoom and leveraging the website to communicate. And obviously some of my time, but I think because of the efforts of especially you, Steve, and anybody honestly who stepped up to be a moderator, that's 90%. So, yeah.
Ed had his hand up before me.
Yeah, can I ask a quick question about so about Hilo? We originally had to pay some kind of fee to ProSocial Commons in order to get on this rather private that wing of Hilo that we were in. Because I had people find or look for the evolutionary philosophy circle through my public posts about it or other random means, and they always had trouble, like they weren't able to get into the ProSocial. Like you needed to join ProSocial Commons first before you get into our Hilo. Is that going to switch? Are we going to, are these groups, in this case, the Examine Lives group, is that going to move to a public Hilo branch or window? I'm not sure what
Yes.
you even call it.
Yeah. So all the subgroups of the commons are now untethered and free independent groups, liberated. But anyway, so
Okay.
what we can do as part of sharing with new people is we can make those posts public and they can be found on Hilo as well as the group can be public. And so that's an easy way. And Hilo, it doesn't, it's not like we have to be dependent on it. It's just an easy way to do a few things like send emails and kind of just have some of the session details. We could always do multiple things.
Yeah, no, that's thank you. I think Hilo is great for that. It's a really nice social network platform. But yeah, I wasn't sure if it was going to be open use. So great. Okay.
One
So
other thing I forgot to mention, Steve, to your question about the recordings. One thing we can do that I looked up is that you can actually collaborate on a playlist. So what we could do is set that up, I think that could work. And then we would just upload new sessions to the same playlist that it's been on. The other hand, we could just make a new playlist and take those videos and put them there too, just to copy them. But yeah.
So I had a couple of thoughts before it slips my mind, since you mentioned the playlist. I at least personally would prefer that the playlist be a private playlist still on YouTube and not searchable for the entire
Yeah.
world.
I think it would still be restricted in that sense.
Yeah, yeah. Just because I think that, at least for me, that leaves me feeling a bit freer, less inhibited about what I might want to say or talk about. I for one would like to figure out a way to keep these going. I enjoy the times when I moderate. I actually have a topic for January I want to suggest before we're done. In terms of the mechanics of it, one of the things that I want to be sure about is that if Sage is run over by a Mack truck tomorrow, that there's somebody else who has his knowledge that can step in and do what he does. Although I enjoy the hosting, if you will, or the moderating, I don't really personally want the responsibilities of figuring out all these mechanics on high-low. So I would make a distinction between those two functions, and I just want to make sure that Sage is training in, even though he describes it as easy peasy, that somebody else is trained in to do whatever it is Sage is going to do on high-low, so that if we were to lose him for whatever reason, we're not up the creek without a paddle.
Here's what I'll suggest. I'll make a guide for how to self-organize, host, and administer a group, which
in case of my death, open and read this.
Well, here's what I would like to do though. I would like to distribute that anyway, because the sequence of steps would be hard to figure out all on its own, but actually it's all quite simple. And so let me try to democratize that just so we all know. And then much of what I'm doing, we can all just follow the same script. And ideally, if we can share that a little bit more, then I too can participate as a member without, because there's no that's always why I've been participating, but just in the more equal status, share that kind of
one other mechanical question I have is I've been on some other discussion groups, not related to ProSocial World, that have occasionally been Zoom bombed by people that I don't know how they found those groups, but they just came in to be disruptive. And that's never happened with Examine Lives, but I don't know if shifting the way we're talking makes that more likely. And if so, Sage, I assume you as the host are able to boot people out if necessary, or
yeah. And actually, right now, I made you a co-host, Steve, so you could do the same. And
Okay.
I think that goes into something that again Hilo can help with, but just in general, being able to maintain a list of people, and that's also kind of why this has always grown, and most things like this have grown through referrals anyway. So it's not like we're doing any big public advertising, the most of which was just being on ProSocial website, but that's a heavy filter already.
Right.
So.
Yeah. These groups were on Meetup, which is a much more of a public.
Yeah. Andy, you're muted. See you flagging your hand.
Thanks, Sage. So we're at the top of the hour, and I do have to bow out. I think the number one, everything else will be relatively easy to recreate in the case of Sage getting hit by a truck, as long as we all have each other's email. If we have a mailing list, the rest is relatively easy. I think the most important thing to have coming out of this meeting is one or a small number of people who are just committed to seeing to it that a session gets scheduled every month, and just set. And then Steve's been doing a lot. I mean, Steve's right. Coming up with a paragraph for a neat topic, one that stimulates thought, and maybe suggesting a few readings. That's the bulk of the work involved. And I've heard Steve express a willingness to continue and at least uh, in that capacity, or in part in that capacity. And I think Sage, at least for the next few months, can continue with the logistics on the logistics side. Steve, am I hearing right that you are willing to?
Yeah, the way that when you left, Andy, however long ago that was, when you stepped down from your leadership role, the group made a decision at that time that um, anyone was free to suggest a topic, but if your topic was selected, that meant you were in charge of finding the resources and leading the discussion.
Mhm.
What has happened is, with the exception, I think, of Ken and Diane, I've been the one that kept making suggestions, and Hank as well. Yes, sorry, Hank.
I'm ready to make more.
Okay, and so yeah, I enjoy hosting, but it'd be lovely if I don't have to do all 12 months.
What could we have like well, I mean, you'd be the leader here, but could we have like a hosting committee? I mean, there's not that many people here.
Oh no, please, no more committees.
No committees.
Whatever we do,
Okay.
let's not have a
I
committee.
don't mean an
Next thing,
official
Hank, the
committee.
next thing you're going to want me to write a mission statement. Please, no.
Oh no, I can write those. I
Steve,
used to do
how
that.
about minions? How about if you get some minions?
Let's like I said, we have time, so let's
Yeah. My
let's
guess
ease our
is,
way
if,
into.
Hank, if you want to suggest a topic, suggest it, and if people like it, you get to lead the discussion, and that's fine. I did put
I
in
was
the
going to
chat
suggest
one
humor,
for next
Steve.
month. What?
Steve, I was going to suggest humor also.
Well,
so
that's okay. They're brilliant minds.
I'm glad you did it. Yeah,
Brilliant minds think alike, although, as
I
George
know.
Carlin
Yeah,
said, so do stupid minds. So
that's right. As a matter of
Let's-
fact, we all think alike. There's a guy. I won't talk now. We don't have to.
That's evolution for you.
there you go.
We'll find a way to share some of, like, I'll write that guide, and then we'll figure out the norm
Yeah.
around how to share that, mostly beyond myself.
It
in some way.
it is. I mentioned this in an email to Sage and Diane. I think we've had 50 of these, I think, and it is increasingly challenging when I think about, well, what topic could we do? We've gone through a lot of the usual suspects that evolutionary psychology might talk about. So sometimes I struggle to come up with a new one, although I suppose we're not precluded from revisiting.
Yeah.
We actually
I don't see why not,
yeah,
because
we
if there
actually
was
did
a,
gossip twice.
Can I make a suggestion that would I think I just thought of this, very good branding. We're at 51, examine lives, it's always into the frontier. But if we want to go back, let's just call it re-examine lives.
Very good.
Well,
gossip
rearrange-
re-examined.
Then
Well,
yeah,
rearrange
pre-examine.
Socrates. The re-examined life is worth living. Yes.
There you go.
There we got it. Look, I'm willing to, if I have a good teacher, I'm willing to take on some of the technical stuff. I mean, I need to get more on top of it anyways. And if I have a good teacher, I'm ready for backup.
And
whatever.
I also know, thank you, Hank. I also know that Ken, who just signed off, Ken has also indicated a willingness to do some of that. Are folks okay with the topic of humor and laughter for January? Okay,
Yep.
because
Yeah.
I've got some things I can post. No, I got to do it on. Well, it was Hilo where we used to post. Okay, so
Yeah.
yeah, I've got some things I ought to be able to get a post on in the next couple of days with a couple of readings on that topic.
All right,
And
Steve, make
And
sure to hit that
gonna need
announcement.
I'm going to need to think of an evolution joke to start off the discussion with. So if you know any, send them to me.
We'll send them.
Thanks, everyone.
is
Okay.
the schedule going to continue to be third Thursday of every month?
Yeah,
Yes.
I wouldn't see any reason to change it. It seems like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And we've been doing that schedule for a long time. So
I think if we do it 100 times, it'll start becoming a sacred rule. And
Very good.
there you go. There
Well,
you go.
Folks, with AI, we can replicate ourselves
oh, we can meet every day.
every day, and nobody will know. But we can replicate it. I don't know how to do it, but we can find enough people who can get it done.
Okay.
I've been studying up on AI. It's a creepy place, but interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll meet the third Thursday in January, and we'll talk about humor and laughter, and what its adaptive value may be, I guess. And Ed,
Amazing.
awful nice to see you again, Ed.
Good seeing you, Ed. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's good to see you all as well. Yeah, I've been
Nice.
buried on some other things, but this was lovely.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays.
Happy
But Sage,
holidays.
I wish you well. You don't have to get hit by a truck for anybody
I'll be
to
good.
take some of your
Yeah,
work.
please don't.
No,
I'm staying
we don't
away
need
from
to.
roads for the next
Right.
3 weeks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.